Okay, hello, Dr. Doolittle. This is Rebecca. I think you can see me in the corner. I'm using Screencast-O-Matic to do my general constructivism talk. When I was trying to think about how I wanted to talk about general constructivism, I was really struck by our modern conception of marriage, and then the idea of 80-20 that we talked about last class period. The general constructivism is about 80% sociocultural context and 20% individual, which is different from the radical constructivism that we were talking about and reading about this week. So, I decided to talk about marriage for several reasons, just to give you a little bit of background on why. I am currently in the process of going through a divorce, and it has been truly a learning opportunity for me individually, that 20%, about how culture influenced me, that 80%, in my conceptions of marriage, because marriage really is this abstract concept that our culture and all cultures around the world have developed over time. So I'm going to use something that's not educational based. I'm stepping out of my classroom and I'm going to talk a lot about myself and this conception of marriage and how I have my idea of marriage as a cultural construct has changed over time in that 80%, 20% area. Okay, so I have some slides and you're going to see me over here. So I'm from a small town, and getting married in small town USA is what we're supposed to do in our 20s. So I put that on the 80% sociocultural side. So we grow up going to weddings, we grow up talking about them. When I was a little girl, I would buy wedding magazines. This is what we did. And you can also see this perpetuated. It's not just small town USA. You see it in the media. There's so many shows like The Bachelor where people are trying to find love, and shows about buying wedding dresses. And so there really is, within the U.S. culture, still this real big notion that you're supposed to get married. And frankly, in small southern towns, and I've talked to many of my southern friends about this, this occurs in your 20s. Now, I have friends who are from New York City, and oftentimes in your big metropolitan areas, and I know I'm generalizing here, but this is just sort of what I've pieced together in my construction of marriage over time, is that often in larger cities, people marry later, their 30s, their 40s, they have children later. So getting married in your 20s is part of my sociocultural environment. There's also this idea that you do stay married even if you're unhappy. Marriage is hard, marriage is challenging, it takes compromise. There's sort of this thing that once you're married, you're this unit, and whether or not things are working out, you stay together. There's also this concept that there's this religious nature to being married. Most of the married couples in my small town, even if they weren't religious prior to being married, they start going to church, and they all have kids. So again, marriage, you go from being this single person in college in your early 20s doing whatever the hell you want to do, excuse me, but that's what it is, to, let's get married by 25, and whoa, if you're pushing 30, you're really becoming an old maid. And this shocks me because I'm saying this and I am a very, very, very independent, strong female, and I still know that this is all internally in women because I talk to women all the time about this stuff. And then you're supposed to start going back to church and having kids. And then this is the thing that fascinated me about my small town. Affairs become the norm. I know so many married couples who have had affairs. And it really fascinates me. So you stay married, you have this affair, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. This is part of sort of my sociocultural context in which marriage occurs. My grandparents had affairs. It wouldn't shock me if my parents had had an affair, although they've never told me this. But this is just sort of the environment that I come from. So then there's this 20%, which is Rebecca, the individual. I did in my 20s have this feeling that I needed to get married. And I know that it was a lot of social pressure, but really I can remember being 25, and that's when I met my husband that I'm getting ready to get divorced from. I just wanted a companion, and I was ready to have somebody to travel with and do all sorts of things with. So he came along and he was serious, and of course I'll say, yeah, we'll get married. I wasn't happy in the relationship before getting married, but something very interesting happened. This 80%, this sociocultural, my environment loved us. We were told by everybody what a great couple we were. My grandparents' friends told us what a great couple we were. So even though I was unhappy and I had this 20% going, this is not right, you don't need to be with this person, I had this giant 80% telling me I was doing the right thing, that this was a good man, I couldn't ask for anybody else, da-da-da-da. I am an atheist, so I don't have religion keeping me in marriage, and I don't want kids, so I don't have that. And so I found after about a year or two of marriage, really questioning, I don't really know why I'm married. I mean, we're not going to have kids. I don't have some religious code keeping me together. I really am not happy in the relationship, so what is it all for? And also, my personal conviction, I think affairs are messy and dramatic, and I would rather not deal with them. And I used to laugh and tell my mom, yeah, I guess one day, and this is when I lived in the small town, I guess I'll have an affair one day probably because that's what happens when people are unhappy. And I felt, this is the 20%, that I could not leave my husband in my small town. I couldn't figure out, and I was sitting there trying to construct how to get out of this marriage. We worked at the same small university. We had all the same friends. And again, that 80% is telling me, my context is telling me that I'm perfect, that I am in a great relationship, even though there's this real internal battle going on within me saying this is not right. And I think when we're talking about constructivism and general constructivism, this is an interesting point when we're dealing with these big abstract conceptions of culture and how we learn things. Marriage and relationships is something that we start teaching kids very early on. They start learning these cultural norms so early. And in this general notion, the individual, I think, oftentimes ends up going underneath what the cultural environment wants you to do. You adapt. So even though I felt unhappy in my marriage, I adapted to my cultural environment, which was saying, this is a good fit for you. And I sort of took the back seat as the individual and let my cultural environment steer me, my socio and cultural environment take me in the right direction. All right, I'm at 7 minutes. Okay, so learning to adapt. So I really became integrated into my small town culture. We were perfect, 80%. I started to really maintain this status quo, this kind of equilibrium. I figured out how to kind of be happy, even though I knew that this wasn't right. So I was still constantly questioning marriage. That's that 20%, despite all these sociocultural influences. But what happens is 4 years go by. I get very rooted in my place, and I adapted to what my group wanted me. You know how we talked about groups the other day? I kind of had light purple hair and didn't realize it, but I dyed it to fit in. And I really was trying to fit in, even though there's this nagging 20%. So fast forward to how I ended up in Blacksburg, and where I really think learning occurs. So I had a disruption. I made the decision to move up here to do my PhD, and by moving away, my 80%, my sociocultural context, completely changed. And all of a sudden, and it happened within about 2 weeks, I realized I had this switch, and my 20% individual kind of became 80%. And all of a sudden, my unhappiness and my desire for change began to override my old sociocultural context. I didn't know anybody up here. They didn't know who I was. The friends I were meeting Rebecca. They weren't meeting Rebecca and her husband. Whereas in my small town, they were meeting me as already part of a group. So slowly, I'm in this, can you see my hands? I'm one group with my husband, and what happens is I break off, and I start to grapple and construct a new knowledge of what I think of marriage. And I really started questioning the things that I mentioned earlier. If I'm not religious, why am I doing this? If I don't want kids, why am I doing this? If I'm unhappy, why am I staying in this? When I was in small town, Southern Virginia, I was staying in it because of that 80% sociocultural. It locked me in. I wasn't ready to construct a new knowledge where I could see myself outside of that 80% group. But I move up to Blacksburg, and that individual side begins to overpower me, and I leave. I make the decision to leave because I learned and I constructed new knowledge. So I really adapted to a different environment, and my old paradigm was no longer viable. And I'm not trying to get into radical constructivism, although I really like it. So to finish up, because I'm at 2 minutes and 19 seconds, this is how I kind of look at general constructivism. We learn from our sociocultural environment and also from how we reflect on this environment. So when I was in Southern Virginia, I was constantly reflecting on this 80% sociocultural environment I was in. And so learning or knowledge creation occurs when we grapple with the sociocultural and ourself. So once I transformed my sociocultural context, I was able to actually construct a new understanding of my conception of marriage and my relationship by removing myself sort of from that 80%. And I think this is really important when it comes to learning, because context is so important. And I think that's what general constructivism is really trying to say with that 80% sociocultural, 20% individual. When that sociocultural is there, sometimes it will override that individual rational sense that's going on, because there is this desire for us to not appear like we're in a chaotic world. And so what I did in my own marriage, the only way that I reconstructed my concept of what I wanted my life to be like in marriage was by being in a different context. I changed my context, and then all of a sudden I fit into a different group. I hope that explains general constructivism. I really wanted to try to move away from the metaphor in education to see if I could kind of look at it from a different perspective. See you in class.